This week on the Bruderhof YouTube channel, we'll be discussing chapter 29 from the book Following the Call, Living the Sermon on the Mount Together. And this chapter is entitled, Teach Us to Pray. The verse is Luke 11:1. One day Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples. So the focus of this chapter is, I think, on that line, teach us to pray. Why do we need to be taught to pray?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rich. And this chapter offers some really great insights on the response to that. Andrew Murray, I felt like he definitely took a deep dive into how we can learn how to pray more effectively. But then I also like how he ended his thoughts, or at least in this excerpt, he says, Jesus never taught his disciples how to preach, only how to pray. And it definitely got me to wondering, what the disciples actually observed Jesus doing. Because obviously, that's how we communicate with God, and that's how Jesus communicates with God. And it must have been a pretty powerful thing to witness, unless he kind of did it in private. But what a great question to ask Jesus, and that question still stands today, and I think still speaks to us today. And also talks about how, before Jesus came to the earth, how people would pray in the expectation of the coming of Christ, and then once Christ arrived, now we're living in the fulfillment of that and in the hopes of the coming kingdom, and how powerful and joyful that is. So Murray has some good things to say, and then there's two schools of thought, though. Yeah.
Can I just pick up on that one thing you said, though? Because I mean, that's a really interesting thing, what you said about this end thing. Jesus never taught his disciples how to preach, only how to pray. And we think about pastoral formation, right?
Yeah.
You think of seminaries, what do pastors in seminaries learn most of all? They learn how to give good sermons, how to talk, right? I don't know how many classes there are on how to pray. Interesting. Because that's a much more difficult thing. It takes a huge amount of humility, as Murray points out. It can only be learned in the school of much prayer, for practice makes perfect. Let but the deep undertone of all our prayer be the teachableness that comes from a sense of ignorance and from faith in him as a perfect teacher. I think oftentimes when we try to talk about Jesus, we may come from a sense of having the answers or knowing what Jesus is like. But by asking Jesus to teach us to pray, we're admitting that we actually have no clue what God is like. And we need help. We need instruction as to what to ask for and how to ask for it. Right. Anyway, I interrupted you.
Yeah. Well, I think, this chapter does just bring up a lot of different angles to think about, which I thought was inspiring, because then Elton Trueblood goes on to say, it's really important in the formation of prayer to not let its meaning be lost and to not just mumble along, because Jesus does warn against, as we've discussed in past videos, warns against just saying stuff for the sake of saying it and not actually saying it from the heart or meaning it, truly getting behind the words that you are praying and speaking to God, not being afraid to do that. But then Pope Benedict comes back and says that liturgy and learning to, saying the Lord's Prayer, saying prayers that have been written, it's it takes effort then to understand what you're trying to communicate and not just saying it for the sake of saying it. So I thought that was also a great point, because it also talks about how that can train us to understand the inner attitude of Jesus in communicating with the Father, and that is also good and helpful for each of us. So I don't know what your thoughts are. Do you think that's two different schools of thought in how to approach prayer? Do they necessarily conflict, or can they actually coincide?
Well, I don't think you only have to say formulaic prayers. I mean, there are times where it is appropriate to pray in specific, for specific circumstances. But the importance of praying in the way that Jesus taught us is that he taught us what, as Pope Benedict writes, in the words of the Our Father, are signposts to interior prayer. They provide a basic direction for our being, and they aim to configure us to the image of the Son. As St. Paul puts it, often we do not know what to pray for, right? We don't really know. And so these, I guess you could call them formulaic prayers, but they are the way Jesus taught us to pray. They express in words the encounter with God experienced, this is Pope Benedict, both by the church as a whole and by individual members of the church. But then he says, when we're praying these prayers, we have to be careful. He quotes the rule of St. Benedict. Our mind must be in accord with our voice.
Yes.
And I find for myself, like personally, when praying the Lord's Prayer, it's really important that you take it a phrase at a time. And it's hard to kind of get your mind quiet and try to understand what you're really saying. Mm-hmm. But it's so vital that, and we're going to go through the Lord's Prayer in the next chapter, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. But I think it's really important that each of those phrases in some way points to Jesus. It points to what the image of God is and how we are to be as people. So it's not, again, that we're asking necessarily for things for ourselves, like we would, write a letter to Santa. But, we're trying to conform our minds to the image of God. So those are my thoughts. You got anything else?
No, I think this is just a great chapter, and you guys should feel free to let us know what you think about it.
Thanks a lot. See you next week.